Hello and welcome to this session. I'm Heather Noonan. I'm the Vice President for Advocacy in the League's Washington, D.C. office. And my partner in planning this session, Stacy Wilson-Margolis, is in the room right here from the League's New York headquarters. And as predicted, this is a topic of intense interest to people at the conference. We thought we might have standing room, and I'm sure by the end of it, that's going to be the case. So thanks so much for being here. We're really pleased that we're joined by some terrific panelists who'll be able to give you their points of view on what is of interest to the new phase of funding. And we're going to be talking not just about what's of interest to new funders, but what are the new priorities of funders who've long invested in this community and in other areas around community impact. So we have Liz Alsina, who has a wealth of information to provide about the larger foundation perspective. Janet Brown with Grantmakers in the Arts, who can describe the kind of full array of funders investing in arts work and community impact. And then locally here in Seattle, Laurel's going to be able to provide a perspective around community connection, but also as the perspective of a board member for the Seattle Symphony. So we have a twofer, I think, in Laurel. Again, it's not a surprise that this is a topic that everyone's interested in. Just for a tiny bit of context, we wanted to take a quick poll and find out the range of budget sizes of organizations in the room. So if you just indulge us really quickly, if you're with a Group 8 orchestra, just raise your hand. Okay. So that's, for a Group 7 orchestra, that's operating expenses around $170,000, that range. Group 6, 520. Group 5, Group 4, Group 3, Group 2, and Group 1. Okay. So, and youth orchestras. Any collegiate orchestras? International orchestras in the room? Okay. So the makeup of funders, what we're learning from the information we're gathering at the League about who's funding orchestras, is actually very diverse, and gifts come in all sizes. So we're learning that actually a really high volume of contributors contribute at lower levels to orchestras, which tells us the people who are interested in contributing to the work that orchestras do are actually quite diverse. And getting a sense of the sizes in the room here, the one thing that we've also learned cuts across budget sizes is that contributed revenue is about 40% on average of your revenue across the board. So obviously, we spend a lot of time at the conference talking about earned revenue and other resources, but this conversation is critically important to the future of the work that orchestras are doing. So with that, the way we'd like to do this is just have some brief comments from each of our panelists first, and then we'd really like to make this a conversation about trends that are being observed, and then turn it to you with your questions. The one thing I just need to mention on the technical side is we are recording the session, so if you have an interest of speaking up, you'll just need to speak to the mic so we make sure we can capture your remarks. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Liz.
Thanks, Heather. Good morning, everyone. It's really good to be here. Just to give you a little bit of a sense of my background, I was actually an arts fundraiser, and I was an institutional giving specialist before switching over to Mellon, and I say this because I feel your pain. So I think Heather started by talking about new priorities, and that is the focus, and we'll go into trends, but I think I want to talk a little bit, take a moment to just talk about the constant priority. And our constant priority, and I think I can speak to my peers, is how we define a charitable institution, which is a mission-based entity that is meeting an unmet need in its community. So that social good component, that public service, is at the very core of all of these trends. And the trends are just the way that we do things, how we serve the public, right? It's always about the public good. So in terms of trends, let's focus a little bit for our conversation on kind of the larger institutions, the larger foundations. Corporate is its own thing, but I will speak a little bit, and if I can, generalize on my peers. So, couple of trends, really broad, but here's the list. Meaningful and intentional diversity and inclusion. I got the meaningful from Janet because I think it's a great thing. Meaningful and intentional diversity and inclusion practices. Social justice is another one that we're really seeing emerging amongst organizations that support the arts. Civic engagement and organizations that assert their public value, really key. New approaches to development processes and the programming itself, and adaptive practices. And we're going to unpack these very briefly. I think for Mellon and for some of our peers, the focus for orchestra grants, we give to, within the performing arts program, we give to a number of arts genres. And within the orchestra program, we've really defined a couple of needs. So we'll narrow in and kind of focus in on those and expand. So I'll start with diversity and inclusion. How are we defining diversity and inclusion? And it's really about the equal representation of your communities in all of your participants. So we're talking about the musicians on your stages, we're talking about the work in your repertoire, your staff, your board, your administration, and the people that come to your audiences, not audiences, and the people that come to your concerts. I'm really careful about, I don't like audiences, I like participants. And the reasoning behind this, just for some context, we have found that of the classic art genres, we think that orchestras have been hit the hardest because of a disconnect with their communities. And we think that diversity and inclusion, there's a real link there. So that's why the emphasis is there for now. And I also just want to add a quick note, and we can expand on this maybe later, that diversity is relative to your communities. We don't have we don't want you to take a prescriptive angle to it. It really is relative to where you are. Another trend that we'll unpack for a second here. So adaptive practice, what the heck does that mean? It means a few things for us at Mellon and for our peers, but I think essentially it just refers to the structural health of your organization and your ability to remain nimble and responsive to your community. So these are things like capitalization plans, cash reserve funds, that kind of thing. But I think it can also be in new earned income revenue generators for yourself. If you're trying a new strategy that is helping you serve your community in a better way and in different ways, and that adds to the vitality of your organization. And we can also unpack that later with some examples. Heather, we're going to have some examples. And then kind of the third big critical piece that we're seeing in the in the orchestra program in particular, is just the civic engagement and the public value. We really think of that as an intentional and authentic partnership with other community organizations, and just thinking about different approaches to how you do your work, where you produce your work. Is it neighborhood series? It can mean a lot of different things, and we can also unpack that with some examples later on in this session. I just want to make sure to give adequate time for everyone to be able to speak. The other point that I don't necessarily think this is a trend, but I think it's worth pointing out as a really unique opportunity amongst the larger foundations is that 20 years ago, large foundations were giving to large institutions. There was a real sink there, and I think right now, especially among some of the larger national funders, we're thinking a lot about geographic diversity, and we're thinking a lot about leadership, and we're thinking a lot about new and interesting or big ideas, and that's happening very broadly. So I think as this is an opportune moment to be an organization, great or small, if you've kind of got these key components in. Sometimes we hear from smaller institutions, well, I just don't think I would ever have been eligible for a Mellon grant or a Kresge grant or, a Duke grant. And I've got to say right now, the door is wide open. So I think that is not so much a trend as much as an observation about the field. And so I think that's, I think the thing we're still trying to figure out that is a challenge is how to make our application processes accessible to institutions that don't have a development machine. So we are still unpacking that internally, and they are questions that we're asking ourselves, but it's not something that we have a simple answer to just yet. But I did want to highlight that the opportunity is there. So that's what that's about as much as I'll unpack for now. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Liz. So I'm really happy to hear, and I'm certain you are too, that Mellon's doors are wide open, and so are just saying.
Thank you, Janet. I'm
That's
now
right.
in trouble.
That's right. Because I think that one of the fears that we've had over the last, certainly since the recession, has been that major institutions, major funding institutions have pulled back on the arts, and indeed that is true. So we've lost about 2% in aggregate foundation funding 2 years ago than we as compared to about 7 years ago. I think that's going to come back. So that's just on our analysis that we get from the Foundation Center. So my name is Janet Brown, and I am President and CEO of Grantmakers in the Arts, which is a national association of private and public funders who fund the arts. I would recommend to you that if you want to know what funders are thinking and talking about, that our website is a huge resource of what funders are doing. We have an ever-changing news feed that's that interests our members, and also different programs that you can see what the trends might be. And we put out every 4 months a publication called The Reader, which is the only arts philanthropy journal in America that is peer-reviewed. And I would recommend that for a mere $35 a year, you can subscribe to this publication. If you don't want to do that and have an actual thing in your hand, it's online and it's free. So if you want to know what funders are thinking, that's a great place. Those are great resources for you. I'm going to talk about.
Somebody has a question already.
What?
Website address?
You can Google Grantmakers in the Arts, and it'll come up. Okay, so Liz took a couple of Liz is right on about what's going on with funders, and I want to talk about it from another angle. There really are 3 components that I think that are important for the change that's happened. One is accountability and transparency in financial management. That funders are seeking more of that from you. Your own board members need more of that from you. If you're a board member, you need to demand more of that. And we've spent the last 4 years on what's called the National Capitalization Project, trying to help funders understand what it takes for an organization to be truly capitalized, and how some of our practices that we've put together in the last 40 years or 50 years of since the Ford Foundation went around and gave all this money to everyone and said, here's how arts organizations should function, that things have changed, and that we need to change along with them. So and part of the situation that we're currently in with the nonprofit art sector being so undercapitalized has been because of institutionalized funders. And then I think that's they're 50% of the problem, and you are the other 50% of the problem. So one of the reasons I say that is a lot of you may not get a large percentage of your budgets from institutionalized funders, and by that I mean our members are private foundations. Mellon, for example, is a member. Doris Duke is a member. Ford is a member. MacArthur, all those big guys, right? Lots of community foundations, public agencies, state arts councils, local arts commissions, as well as community foundations and corporate donors and nonprofit regranters. So we are a big tent. But one of the cultures that has kind of embedded itself in how we operate is this idea that if everyone breaks even, that's success. And the only way that you can build a cash reserve that can protect you from loss in subscriptions is by having a surplus. Many institutionalized funders have punished surplus, not encouraged surplus, just by their own financial applications. So when your expenses have to equal your income, You either have to make the income higher or you have to do something. But the message it sends to you is that we don't want you to have a profit. And then we go just to the general, nonprofit misconception that nonprofits are not to make a profit, which is absolutely not true. So if you are to be able to have a cash reserve, which is the most important thing for you to have, in many ways in today's economy, more important than an endowment, you need to be able to generate surpluses. That means you need to be able to budget in such a way that that you will have a carryover at the end of the year that goes onto your balance sheet. It's all about the balance sheet, right? And the fact your board needs to understand that. So accountability and transparency. Capitalization is, and I'm not talking buildings here, I'm talking the capital you need to meet your missions, to do the work you want to do. Capitalization is the principles of capitalization are universal. On our website, there's actually a little button that says capitalization. You can click on there and see what we're recommending that funders do. But the solutions to capitalization are local. So what I'm happy to hear is that there may be a national organization that can come in and help you do some projects to projects. Your sustainability in your community is local. So this whole idea of somebody in a white horse coming along to save your organization is not going to happen. If someone hopefully told you that years ago and you figured this out. This is good, which leads me to the next thing that I think funders are looking at, which also Liz touched on, and that is community relevancy and engagement, right? So people give money to things that they are passionate about and that they think are important. And if you're not important to the people in your community, then they're not going to give you money. So this is a two-way kind of street, right? So how, not only, and we'll talk about diversity in just a second, but not only do you need to recognize there are populations in your community that you're not reaching, there are also, there's also the realization that you need to engage actively in your community as a corporation, right? So how many of you belong to the Chamber of Commerce? Fantastic. Those are the kinds of things that we need to, instead of being apart, I mean, for many years arts organizations were kind of separate, right? They're special, we're so special. When in fact, we are a business operating within a community that provides services and employs people and all of that kind of thing and needs to function like that. So engaged in government policies, engaged in corporate policies through the Chamber of Commerce, engaged in education policies through your boards of education, and just engaged in the community with a voice, right? Are you writing letters to the editor and sending in blog notes about what's happening in your school music programs? That is, your voice is important. And once you put your voice out there, all of a sudden people pay attention to you as being important. So there's an engagement role that needs to happen before money asking happens and before you even get people into your into the to the hall. So community engagement and relevancy. Act like a corporation, act like a storefront business that gives back, that is as critically concerned about the economic and social well-being of your community as is your bank, the bankers and the insurance guys and all that stuff. Be at the table with them. Rotary, Lions Club, whatever it takes, be at the table. Community engagement. And then what are you doing outside of your hall? Right? How important are you to everybody outside of your hall? I'd love to see one of those signs on the road that says, the next 5 miles have been litter-free thanks to the Toledo Symphony Orchestra. Those kinds of things. I'm not picking on Toledo. I hope there's anyone here from Toledo. It just popped into my head. I don't know why. The third thing, and then I need done here so we can move along. The third thing I want to talk about is meaningful. before that, I want to go back to accountability and financial management. So this also includes a better training and comprehension by your board of your board of trustees, right? So they, as the ambassadors of the organization to the public, need to understand what it costs really to operate your organization. I think for too long we have this dilemma, and Laurel and I were talking about this earlier. We have this dilemma about certainly staff people, professional staff people, want to even put a good face to their board. So sometimes you have staff people not being as transparent as they need to be, and some of you, not anyone in this room, I'm certain, but not being as transparent as they need to be with the very family members, think of them as family members, who can get you out of this hole, right? Transparency, transparency, transparency. And then that also goes to your major donors. So when you sit down one-on-one with people and you talk about what we need is fungible capital. We need cash in the bank that will help us if the roof caves in. Every corporate person in the world understands what fungible money is, right? We don't understand it in the nonprofit sector because we don't have any. And we haven't for decades. But it's time for us to start thinking that way. Okay, so training trustees, being as honest with trustees, and also trustees asking hard questions. You're not on this board for fun. This is a business. It needs to succeed. It needs to make a profit. It's not fun. It's work. Now, you may lose some people, but then you didn't want them anyway. Okay, so then meaningful diversity. And by meaningful diversity, I think we were talking, Liz and I are talking about exactly the same thing. It goes to the engagement in community, but it also means at every level. Governance level, and it used to be that everybody, your funders would always say, well, you need to put diverse people on your boards of directors. And that's great, and that's a great start, but that hasn't gotten us very far. So I wouldn't call that meaningful. And I think one of the reasons I think that that's happened is because we never asked we never were honest with those folks when we asked them to come on the board about why we wanted them on the board, right? We never asked them to be a gatekeeper to a community to help us understand what can this organization do to a community that trusts you more than they trust me, right? So governance, programming. If the Western canon is all you want to do, then your audience is going to be white forever, primarily. So think about programming, diversity of programming, not only in ethnicity, also in age, right? It has to happen. And we all know the demographics of what's happening in this country, even in the smallest places of what's happening in this country. So that's important. And then also in audience development and where you take your players out into the community. So it may not be the places that have the best acoustics. Some of these things we have to, just be able to juggle a little bit. So meaningful diversity, honest diversity, not just to get butts in seats, right? Or not just to make it look good on your grant application. The last thing I want to say about institutional funders is that they're not, they're a small portion of the money that you may be able to get. But they determine how organizations behave. And so that's why our work at Grantmakers in the Arts to help funders help you is critical. So when a major foundation like Mellon says we want everybody to now do 3-year strategic plans, guess what? Have you all got your 3-year strategic plan? Yes, I did mine in the basement last night, That's how that's how organization behavior changes. And so it's important for us that there is this serendipity between the funding community and the arts organization community, arts sector. It can no longer be this sort of adverse kind of parent-child relationship. It needs to be more of a partnership. And in a lot of ways, arts organizations and their staffs need to step up to say, we're here as a partner. We're not going to take that grant because it doesn't fit our mission. It's going to extend our staff too far. I mean, even though it's money, are we chasing it? I mean, we need to make those kinds of decisions too. So I'll let it go at that and then hand it over to Laurel.
Thank you, Janet. It's been fascinating to listen to Liz and Janet, and I will not repeat some of the points they made, but I might underscore a few of them. In the sense of full disclosure, not only am I on the Seattle Symphony Board, but I have been a volunteer for Seattle Opera for 42 years now, and my husband is the past president of the Seattle Opera Board and currently the chairman. So we have gotten to know arts organizations pretty well over the years. I'm going to give you a bit of background on the Nesholm Family Foundation, just to put this in a context. When we made our first grant 27 years ago, I believe it is now, we were the new ones on the block, but there were other organizations, family foundations and corporations that gave to the arts, and now there aren't that many in Seattle, and we're in kind of a lonely position, and we'd love to encourage more, but don't know how to do that. It is a family foundation, but we now have 7 board members, our 2 daughters, my husband and I, and 3 outside members who have been with us since the beginning. And I think amongst all of us, we cover all the arts, theater, ballet, symphony, opera. So, but we do give only in Seattle. And we not only give to the arts, but to health and human services and education. Originally, we were giving about 40% to the arts and 30% to the other 2 areas. But with some long-term commitments that we have to a couple of arts organizations, and the fact that the recession hit us a bit and we're bouncing back, our major gifts are to the arts, which I'm sure makes all of you very happy. We're a pretty formal group insofar as we have guidelines and an application. As you are probably aware of in your communities, you might have family foundations that just decide how much they're going to give. They may know you or not know you. We really like to get to know our grantees. And we will make site visits, and we find that to be very helpful, because one of the things we look for always is strong leadership, good vision, good management, and that's the place where you can find that. Through our guidelines, we've listed several objectives, and some of these relate to the arts. So I'm just going to read what they all are. That's one of the barometers of how we consider our grants. Enhance the quality of life, affect significant numbers of people in positive ways, encourage the involvement of others, leverage our assets to increase the project's long-term impact, and specifically in the arts, encourage the highest professional performance standards, improve the availability and accessibility of the arts, support artistic and organizational development. And Janet and Liz have both talked about those in very real, concrete ways about doing that. And what else do we look for over and above that? Transparency, I will say that again, because that's extremely transparent, because we hear things from time to time from board members or from other organizations in the community that don't necessarily jive with what we are told. In fact, we know of one administrative leader in the arts, one unnamed organization, who said, no bad news goes to the board. Well, clearly, there's always some bad news to report, and you need the help of your board to work on that. We also look for board participation and its financial support. Is giving 100% of your board, or does your board give every single person? Even if it's a small amount, that's a pretty important piece. The variety of funding sources. Don't rely on one or two major funders, or you're going to get in trouble when they disappear and you have no source. And we usually get a good sense of the quality of the work, even though the actual product may not appeal to our tastes. You know, we feel that these arts organizations do offer a lot to our community. Obviously, good fiscal management, and we recognize the importance of outreach, developing new audiences, events in underserved communities, as Janet was outlining, pay what you can performances. Some of those in the neighborhood organizations are particularly valuable because it brings in people who may not otherwise attend. Excuse me, but we feel in Seattle we have some very fine major arts organizations. Seattle Symphony is forging new ground through programming, new audiences, and its trip to Carnegie Hall. And I think many of you are going to the concert tonight, and I hope many are going to the concert tomorrow night with Sir Mix-a-Lot for the Sonic Evolution, which will be reviewed by the New York Times too. So we're getting some recognition there. And obviously Seattle Opera is known nationally and internationally for Wagner and the quality of its performances throughout the year. Same with Pacific Northwest Ballet and the Repertory Theater. We're proud to support these major institutions, and we might be one of those few organizations that will give basically unrestricted grants. That means to productions, because that's what your main focus is to put something on the stage. And we don't want you to try to create something new just for us. You're the experts, we aren't. We're not going to tell you how you should manage your programming necessarily, or create a new program just because we think it's a good idea. You've got to think it's a good idea. And I think we're fortunate essentially that we believe in supporting the common good, the civic institutions, and to our family and our board, music is at the center of it. The life of the mind is also important. And I think extending that life of the mind and intellectual interest to underserved communities also opens up horizons for them. So I have a lot more things to say, but I think I'll save those for later when we get into examples and questions and answers.
Thanks very much. I have a long list of questions now that, having heard what you have to say, that I'd love to ask. I know other folks probably do too, but I'll start out with a couple of things, and we did discuss in advance that it would be helpful to kind of punctuate this with some examples that could translate into practices back in your own community. But the first one is probably an impossible question to answer, but in terms of examples, the list of funders who will fund operating and capitalization. I know there's not a place to turn for the list, but in lieu of that, Janet, you said that you put out through GIA a challenge or are just forwarding the conversation around funding of capitalization, and it might be helpful to just get a read on what's the response to that conversation from the community of funders.
Well, first of all, I just want to make sure everyone understands that when you've talked to one funder, you've talked to one funder. This is my life. Welcome to my life. They all have a board of trustees. They all have different goals. They all have different missions. They all have different purpose. So, but we've done our capitalization workshop for funders in 15 cities. It's been very well received. I think that there is a whole new movement going forward, particularly around the need for cash reserves, the need for a good board policy about cash reserves and what your cash reserves are for. I think that's a new discussion that hasn't really been. Liz can maybe talk about that, whether or not it's a new discussion. But I think that that's taken hold. And really that came about because of the recession. So we had major institutions during the recession, of course, that had $200 million in an endowment and couldn't pay their light bill. Some of you may, understand how this goes. But they had tied up restricted capital that they could not use to pay staff or their musicians or to do another concert. So this idea of having no liquidity is really a dangerous factor in the nonprofit arts sector. Funders recognize that. I think that's become a rallying cry. I'll have to say on Mellon's, for Mellon, they've been one of the leaders in this area, and certainly led by Susan and Liz in talking about this and being more open with their grantees. Also, general operating support, which is the best gift that we recommend a funder can give an arts organization, has grown over the last 20 years from 19% in terms of the foundation world to 35%. So that's a real positive sign I see in terms of, I mean, general operating is the real trust. We trust your organization. We want a partnership with your organization. This is our investment, as opposed to we'll fund this project that only does, you know, this one little thing. So I don't know if that answered your question, but
I think it's really helpful just to get a read. If
Yeah.
you say 50% of the challenge is on where funders
Right.
move next in this area, and the other half is where we go. It's
Yeah.
helpful to know kind of what's the climate like as people approach funders in this conversation.
And I think the climate is good. And one of the reasons we put the National Capitalization Project summary and recommendations for funders on our website open to the public is that if you're able then to go to your funders and say, you know, in a nice, polite way, this is what I understand has been recommended by a national association that recommends best practices to funders, and we concur. We really need X, Y, and Z. So it's a tool for everyone.
Do you want to add to that?
I'll just quickly add, and just kind of going back to Janet's initial points about, you know, your organization is a business, and we really respect institutions that are thinking about the long-term strength of their financial position. And I think, you know, the endowment structure works beautifully in higher education because the pot is massive. And relative to arts organizations, we were finding that, again, during that financial crisis, it just became so clear that that endowment structure maybe doesn't always work for organizations. I don't want to say it doesn't work generally, because it actually does for some, but it's when you've got substantial amounts invested, which is why we have really shifted our focus in capitalization towards cash reserves, cash reserve types of grants, and your kind of day-to-day needs, and sort of, you know, understanding that you're going to have better cash flow in certain months over others, and that's just part of your business practice, and that's okay. So we're absolutely in your corner there with Janet.
So all three of you talked about the importance of connecting up to the public good and public value and reaching diverse segments of the community and participation from diverse segments of the community. And I wanted to just kind of throw out a general question about how grantees approach that in an authentic way. And what are the things you're looking for to demonstrate authentic approaches to that kind of public value or public good?
Yeah, I'll start a little bit on this. You know, I think the most important thing is that when you're approaching diversity and inclusion, it has to come from a place of respect, right? I think we talked a little bit about what we're talking about in diversity inclusion in terms of staff and board, and, you know, I outlined a whole list. And the other thing that one thing that I forgot to mention was an internal cultural shift. You've got to have internal buy-in first, right? Everyone's got to be on board before you, and on the same page, and think that this is a priority in order for you as an institution to move forward with these kinds of practices. So that, I think, gets a little bit at the heart of authenticity. I wanted to go back and kind of add to a point that Janet made regarding, you know, if you only do Mozart or the Western canon, you're going to have a white audience. I just want to add that audiences of all kinds of colors and backgrounds can appreciate Mozart. But no, not at all. But really, I think what you want to emphasize is bridging. How do you make those connections and contextualize it and reach out to those communities? So I think some of the programs we've found most successful have been programs that come from that place. And sometimes it isn't about, we're obsessed with bringing people into our halls. How about going to community venues? How about sprinkling in some programming from the classic Latino artists or Black composers that are out there, and they're there. So I think that that's talking about diversity and inclusion. We're not, I don't think anyone is trying to get rid of the Western canon. We love the Western canon. I think we're just trying to invite people from all kinds of backgrounds to appreciate it, and also for us to learn from their experiences. Diversity and inclusion is about an exchange, right? It's a two-way street. So I will add that about diversity. I'll just give some examples of the kinds of diversity programs that we have supported. We had an orchestra that was in a very large Latino population. They weren't seeing it reflected in their audiences. So we actually helped them, provided them some support. They came up with a multi-pronged strategy for engaging and connecting to those audiences. And what I loved is that they hit lots of different points. So first, they worked with a Latino marketing firm, a very well-respected one, and really just worked with them on outreach and just kind of, how do we do this? How do we speak to this community that we really want to engage and learn from? Came from respect. So that was one component of it. The other component of it was they created a committee of Latino leaders that helped inform their decision and just, verified that what the marketing firm was suggesting really felt appropriate. And then, of course, they also became advocates, and some of them actually became board members. So that's also a great thing. And then the other component of it was that they created a series that celebrated Latino composers. So it was Latino classical composers, but it was also Latino composers of every genre, and they worked with the orchestra. So it gave the orchestra opportunity to work with a whole new set of artists, and it actually ended up being really great just culturally, internally. So that's kind of an example of a diversity and inclusion practice. Another one would be, again, I think we talked a little bit about diversity is relative to your community. So one of the orchestras that we've supported happened to be in an area with a very high Native American population that they just weren't reaching. And from the outset, they said the goal isn't necessarily to get them into our halls, but we just want to be a part of their lives, and we want to learn from them. So what they ended up doing was doing a series of residencies in different reservations, in area reservations. And they actually commissioned a piece with a Native American composer who didn't actually write in the same kind of, in our more traditional composition method. So it was a lot of back and forth and kind of learning from each other, which again was really great for the orchestra. But it really emphasized that exchange. So those are just some examples. Do you want to go ahead?
Well, I just wanted to say when that came out of my mouth, I knew I was going to get in trouble for it, because I've gotten in trouble for it before, but then it's also an indication of that we hold on, that there's, well, no, I'll just stop on there. But I also want to say that I was on the board of directors of the organization that you just talked about, which was the Lakota. Oh, sorry. Okay. At the time, the Symphony did this project, and it was a fantastic project. And Mellon supported this. It's a rural state. It's a rural symphony orchestra, and it was a wonderfully meaningful project. So anyway, I just wanted to apologize for getting myself in trouble. So the other side of that is that it's an indication. Well, I also want to say that Grantmakers in the Arts has for the last 4 years worked on racial equity within philanthropy, and this is a problem that we have in our communities, just being able to talk about race. So when you say something like that, everyone immediately, the response is immediately, oh, are you saying that there aren't people of color who love Mozart and Beethoven and Bach? And of course that's not what we're talking about. But what we are talking about is meaningful diversity in your community, and that comes from respecting other cultures and respecting folks that may not want to buy a ticket and come into your hall because it is totally alien to them to do that. And it's scary. And it's, those are things that we all have to accept, and we have to talk about it more transparently within our own communities, just like capitalization. The racism issues in our country are also very local. And the diversity issues are not going to be solved by a national consultant that comes into your community. It's going to be solved by the very people who live there. So that's what I have to say about that.
Well, the reality is also, I think that ticket cost is a real barrier to getting people in the door. But Seattle Symphony has done a couple of Day of Music events over the last few years where the hall is open and there's a variety of kinds of music for all ages. There'll be a formal concert in the main auditorium, a variety of different musical groups ranging from rock to drums to can't even think of all of what they were. And throughout the day, the hall is just bursting at the seams. Kids have a chance to play instruments, and you see a very diverse audience, and you do see that it's starting to break down the barriers. Seattle Opera did a simulcast a few years ago of the live production of Madama Butterfly, and the simulcast was in the Key Arena. Tickets were free, and there were people who came in and loved it and sat enthralled, and they would love to go to another performance sometime, but it's the ticket barrier or the price barrier that's the problem. And then of course there are those folks who say, but I don't like classical music. And I have a friend who said, well, to her young friends, do you like movie music? I love it. Well, that's what it is. It's the same thing. It's just that these days music is written for movies. So it is a real challenge. I wish I had some answers.
So you've all talked about the importance of demonstrated impact at the community level. Laurel, you talked about it being long-term impact, so impact over time is of interest to your foundation. And Janet, I've heard you, and I'm a little bit of a student of what Janet Brown is saying on any given day, but I've heard you in a couple of settings express, while you talk about nonprofit arts organizations regarding themselves as businesses in terms of having a seat at the table civically and showing up where those conversations happen, you're also a little skeptical about economic impact as being a convincing measure of impact at the community level where the arts are concerned. So I was wondering if it's a little bit of a thorny thing, but from a funder's point of view, when we talk about measuring impact and reporting back on the outcomes of a funded project or impact as part of a potential application, what are you thinking lately?
Well, I just think overall that that's not our argument. I mean, we will lose every, battle about how important are the arts economically to our community. Are they as important to Seattle as Amazon, or I mean just in the perception of it. I mean, we spend a lot of energy trying to argue those points. So it always makes me just a little bit crazy about that. I don't think one of the good things about, I think, in the institutionalized funding world is that most folks are like Liz. They came from the arts world. They're artists themselves, most of these program officers, and they understand what it takes to run an organization and keep it going in the community, and they understand more than we probably give them credit for the intrinsic value of having artists live in the community and work in the community. So I don't think that that's a great component for, it seems to be a more of a tool for us to convince other people, not necessarily our funders or our supporters, but our mayors and our county executives and business leaders. But I think I don't think that's a strong battle for us, and I've always been worried about how much money we've put into economic development studies that we could have put into doing something for the community that someone would say, wow, did you go to that symphony event, and wasn't that fabulous, and it was open to everybody, it was a picnic downtown, or the Key Arena, those kinds of things I think are more relevant for us. And the other thing I just want to touch on for a second, and this is Laurel's point too, is about perception and about the arguments about our organizations. Is that I think one of the things we don't talk about enough is how why the community is better because your organization is there, and that goes directly to musicians, right? And artists, believe it or not, don't have this organizational angst that we all who run organizations have. They flow from the jazz club to the symphony hall to the outdoor concert to jamming with friends. I mean, they are right. There are no barriers for them, and we need to talk about the fact that by having this orchestra, you have church organists, you have choir directors, you have teachers who are teaching 6- and 7-year-olds how to play the viola. You have in your community these resources that are able to live there, even if you don't pay them, if you're not a professional orchestra that pays them a full living, you at least give them the outlet for their passion that keeps them in this place. And so the offset of that becomes really more than we're just an organization that y'all need to support. We are this army of creative, passionate people who work in every aspect of this community artistically, because that's what they do. So anyway, I just think that's a good thing to keep in mind.
Well, talking about impact, that's something that we ask in our application to begin with. And a number of years ago, it was not a music group, but another arts group in town who, well, we really wanted them to be honest, but here's what it was. I actually looked it up to see what it said. They wanted to reach, educate, and make profound changes in the lives of at-risk students. They wanted to deal with these issues: drug abuse, racism, teenage suicide, family life, teen pregnancy, to name a few, for a short-term 1-week project. And we said, no, you can't do it all. Pick one thing, and that would be my advice, is pick one thing where you really want to make an impact. Another was from a music group. They were doing a neighborhood concert. They wanted money to support a little concert in a high school, or like a high school auditorium. Their goal was to reach 100 people over 3 days. No, we said no, because that's a pretty tiny impact for our money. You know, if they'd say we want to get, they don't always reach the goals, of course, but that's not going to fly with anybody. We do take risks from time to time, though. There was a theater who, a number of years ago, was going to have doing a play about a mentally ill homeless person. And they were going to do post-performance discussions with the audience, mental health experts, people from homeless agencies. We were absolutely charmed when we got the end of grant period letter back, because that's something we always ask for, to see if there was any kind of impact. And they said it didn't work. Nobody wanted to stay after to talk about mental illness and homelessness, but they did request a grant later, and we did consider it, and I'm sure we gave to them. But so again, honesty and transparency has a lot of value. It's worth being honest. During the recession, we wrote to all organizations who applied to us to say, before we consider your grant, we would like you to say how you address what you're doing because of this impact on you. And we got some very good and thoughtful responses back. One music group said, we have no problem. Our board will take care of us. Well, lucky you. Things are under control. Another larger arts organization wrote back a letter that had made no sense whatsoever. It was just filling in some putting a combination of sentences together that had nothing of substance. We said, okay, we will consider your grant when you tell us what you are really doing. So again, the impact has to be there both at the beginning and the end.
Yeah, I'll just add a few thoughts. So impact is a very loaded word, right? So we feel it internally as well, and I think just something that I'm going to add is, at Mellon we don't ask about impact. We ask about how you're defining success and how you're going to measure it and how you're going to see how you can tell if it worked or not. You know, we think of our grantees, and I think a lot of our peers think of them this way. You know, every grant is a combination of an investment, a great risk, and a huge, huge symbol of trust and respect. So that's where we're coming from, and I think in terms of impact is something that we also have to do internally. What did our grant making, when we're looking at our portfolio, what did we do? I mean, if we're looking at a year's worth of grants, what was the impact? And we don't have an answer for that. We don't have an answer for how to measure that. So just as you're struggling to, how do we measure impact? And you know, for something that is so, the art is so ephemeral, and it kind of lives in here a little bit, right? And sometimes that is very hard to quantify, and we appreciate that. We are empathetic to it. I think what switching the impact conversation a little bit, instead of instead of thinking of a logic model, I don't know how many of you have had to do some of those, yikes. Instead of thinking of it as a logic model, we just think about, what does success mean? And it should mean maybe 4 or 5 bullet points, you know, maybe it's 1. And that's okay. But sometimes we go into projects, and I've had this on my end as a fundraiser and as a practitioner, where I go into a project and I'm just like, okay, we're going to do this and this and this. And it's like, wait a second, step back. What is the point of this? And what is going to define that this was a successful project for us? Is it going to be that, you know, out of this new music series that we created, we have 10% of them are people that actually are part of our main stage series in 2 years. Maybe it takes 2 years, and that's okay. But I think instead of thinking about impact, which is just so loaded and is very broad, think about what your definition of success is. And, you know, how are you going to know if it worked or not? And sometimes that's what we support. Sometimes we need to hire a consultant because we can't measure this on our own. These are stats that we can't quite, we don't have the staff to measure. So maybe that's how that's the area of support. So just thinking about it that way.
So in just 1 minute, if it's possible to do this in 1 minute, I wanted to ask one more question to the panel and then open it up for your questions. But I was wondering if you wanted to maybe put a little bit of a challenge out to folks, so when they go back to their organizations and are rethinking how this changes an approach to fundraising institutionally, what is maybe one question people can bring back to their institution or to their board or the team and development team and others to help reorient their thinking to be consistent with the direction that funders are starting to head?
I would say, what do I do as an institution that nobody else in this community does better than I do? That's my thought.
And I would ask yourself if you're budgeting for a surplus.
I'm going to take something I heard from the session that I was at just prior to this. How do you engage your board to really be advocates of your organization? Because I suspect that maybe you have a range of people who are involved and who aren't involved. But I think a good goal is to increase their level of engagement so that they can in turn help you and probably come up with a surplus at the end.
Thank you. Okay. So now we're ready for your questions. And just a reminder, if you have a question, just step up to the microphone right here so we can capture it. And introduce yourself as well, please.
Hi, I'm Kimberly Meiston. I'm Director of Community Engagement for Vocal Essence. We're a professional chorus in Minnesota. And my question really has to do with trends in funding programs that serve a smaller audience more deeply versus a larger audience in a more superficial way. Just a specific example is we've worked with the aging adult population, people in their between 75 and 90, and tried out a program this past year where we brought groups of those people and we broke a wheelchair record, thank you very much, in one of our big performing arts venues. And we brought this big group of people to a concert, and we also went to their assisted living facility and did some programming there. But as I've been learning more and more about this audience, if you're really going to make a big impact in terms of the health benefits of the aging, especially in terms of memory care, the best thing to do is to have it ongoing and consistent. So something that is once a week for long term or twice a week. And it actually does more for these folks than medication oftentimes. Research is showing. So that is my question for you. Where is the trend right now?
We've always looked for those kinds of outreach projects that deeper is better, constant, not just a one-off, not just 3 days and then you're done, and what do you retain from that, whether it's for children or seniors or anyone. I think at least that's what we prefer.
And I think this is an area where, we're doing a lot of work right now in the arts and healthcare, and I know Vocal Essence very well. Is your boss here? No. Okay. It's an area where funders are having a hard time getting arts funders are having a hard time understanding their role, right? So because it gets away from the traditional funding, the art form itself, into a more kind of therapeutic. It's a different area, but there are also health funders that are open to you. So I mean, I think putting together a long-term program is a great idea, but I think you need to find the right partners. You need to find the partners in that health arena that are working. And when the study gets done in San Francisco about the choral things that are going on there, it's going to be fantastic, and that will give you ammunition to do that. But I think partnerships, for arts groups to partner is with non-arts groups who are in that arena is the best thing for you to think about.
Yeah, and I'll just agree. I mean, deep ongoing presence is really what we like to see just across the board in a diversity of different kinds of programs. I think this question is really applicable. And it's not necessarily about the audience. We don't always want the big razzle-dazzle HD project or that's going to reach 1 million people, across the internet. But sometimes there's room within our individual portfolios for a range of depth and for a range of audience, for lack of a better word, or participants impacted. But generally, we really value deep, ongoing relationships.
Hi, I apologize, my voice is going. What do you recommend that either small organizations or organizations that have not been funded by large foundations, what do you recommend that we do to get on your docket and to be noticed and funded, hopefully?
Yeah, that's tricky, right? Getting your foot in the door. It's the biggest issue. I mean, I can't be prescriptive about that because every foundation has its own practice, right, about how to make the approach. So generally, I would always suggest it's got to be respectful. You kind of have to start monitoring how many times you reach out to someone, and also be really careful about the information that you do present. I do believe in just not the handwritten letter, but in terms of some kind of formal introduction, some kind of a formal letter. For the most part, we actually read those. But again, it's so hard to generalize, because I know that I've got colleagues that really aren't responsive to that. But for the intents and purposes of this question, let's say a letter is actually recommended. But I think one of the things that is the trickiest part, and this is actually the trickiest part. So the larger foundations are usually giving to a variety of things. There isn't a single top 25 largest, correct me if I'm wrong, top 25 foundation that is exclusively giving to the performing arts. There are other areas that they're giving to.
I think you're right.
So because of that, I would spend time understanding what the other priorities are, and then within the performing arts program, whatever it may be, what the priorities are within that. Because if you've got this one shot to do your letter and maybe somebody's going to read it, depending on the organization, you've got to have a very tailored message, and present the programs that will most likely appeal. How do you learn about that? I mean, do you have a couple of foundations in mind that you are thinking of approaching? I'm sorry, which area are you based in? New York. You're in New York. Okay. So you've got a couple of different folks that are based there, and then you've maybe got some bigger, broader opportunities. I mean, I think don't spend your time trying to research 20 of them. Research 3. The really strong candidates, and not the ones where you're stretching personally as an institution to fit into their guidelines, but where you actually fit right now at this moment in your institution. And just focus on that. And then it becomes, especially if they're in New York, are they speaking on any panels? Are they doing any kinds of presentations? Any kind of opportunity where you can actually get some kind of FaceTime that is not a meeting, because they won't take an initial meeting, right? So it becomes a question of how can I find out what exactly it is within this performing arts program of theirs that they actually fund. Because, even within Mellon, we have nuances. What we prioritize in orchestras is not the same for what we're prioritizing in opera, in dance, and in theater. So that's kind of my biggest suggestion. And then it's that letter. But that letter shouldn't happen more than twice a year, right? And don't put them on any kind of newsletter. Be careful. Don't put them on any annual appeal. It happens. So it's just be really careful about cultivating them, and trying to be there when they're making some kind of a public appearance, which most major foundations do. Sorry, I don't have more specific.
At least with major foundations, you can. No, he's coming. You can. You know what they want. They have a website. They have criteria. They have a process. So that's easy to do. What Liz is asking.
That's what I would recommend too. Find out how do you fit their guidelines. The other piece is to look at what have their past grants been and for what. That'll give you a sense of their interests as well.
I'm Jody Weisfield. I'm with the Pittsburgh Symphony, and many of the priorities you've talked about are priorities for our organization, but we found the best way to advance them is not with a full orchestra. It's with sextets and octets and chamber groups. But the way our contract is, it doesn't really, we have a great program called Service Exchange, so there's a way to do it within our musicians' contracts. But I'm just wondering, as you talked about that foundations kind of set the, I don't want to say agenda for orchestras, but are you seeing any orchestras doing innovative things with their contracts where we can accomplish these priorities, use chamber groups in a way that it counts as general operating and works within our business model?
So when you say that counts as general operating, are you saying that you can get support for the project for the groups to do those?
For paying for the music. So we have a service for us is defined as 18 plus musicians.
Right.
So if we want to do something with a sextet, We have some
Oh, I see what you're
vehicles for
saying.
doing it without
Yeah,
actually
I see
having to
what you're saying.
hire our musicians.
Right. So you're talking about the contract, musicians contract.
Exactly. I was just curious if you're seeing any contracts changing to advance these.
I don't have a sense of any.
No, but there should be. So who's negotiating contracts next? This is something you need to talk about.
Yeah.
Really. And good for Pittsburgh. We have great members in Pittsburgh, as you know. You're wonderful.
Well, the only thing I could add to that is that there are occasions when Seattle Symphony players do volunteer some time for, say, we had an event at our home for our neighborhood, or a zip code, and 3 musicians came and played, and it was pro bono, and it really generated some good feelings amongst everyone. But as far as contract, I don't know.
That's a tough. I mean, I think it should be a trend. I mean, unfortunately, these contracts are lag behind, right? So everybody lags behind what is happening in the marketplace, because they've contracted. You've done that contract for a few years out. So if now you're saying, I'm sorry, we can't get funding for this thing anymore because we need to change that 18-player minimum to 6. But maybe you could be the first. You could get in there, negotiate that contract.
Hi.
This will be our last question, and then we'll wrap
Well,
up.
Kareem George from Detroit Symphony, and we do have a contract that does that, so I just wanted to
Yay, nice.
welcome anyone who wants to talk.
Right.
We're happy to.
That's
Thank you.
fantastic. That's great.
Thanks, Kareem. And will you join me in thanking our panel for this?
And thank you for doing the real work. Real work.